What is up, ladies and gentle nerds? It's your boy Graham, also known as HamHawks42 on the internet, and today is going to be the last round of Zendikar spoilers, because hey, it's better late than never. Am I right? I think I'm right. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at Cherix, the Raging Isle, and the reason that I wanted to look at this card specifically is that it's crazy. It's really that simple. This card is a monstrosity in the best sense of the word, and interestingly enough, it's in blue, and it's in blue in a way that is very unique and works well flavorfully for what they're doing. So Charix, the Raging Isle, it costs 2 blue. It is a Leviathan crab that is a 0/17. 0/17, and it has some text on it too. Spells your opponents cast that target Charix, the Raging Isle, cost 2 more to cast, so it's kind of that soft quasi-hexproof that we've seen on some other cards in the past. And then you can pay 3. Charix gets plus X minus X until end of turn, where X is the number of islands you control. So in a mono blue deck, this thing is absurd. Now, the fact that it's a 0/17 means that it's a phenomenal blocker right away on turn 4, and so it's able to block very nicely. Now, it doesn't have reach, so flyers are still a concern, but it just is capable of absorbing anything that's flying at it that doesn't have death touch. So that's amazing. And on top of that, the artwork on this thing is gorgeous. And there are 2 different versions of it. One is showing what looks like, you can actually see on the artwork, there's some greenery depicted on the top of a gigantic crab that is clearly rising. It's rising up out of the ocean. Like, it looks like an island stood up, and and underneath it there was a huge crab monster, and it's fantastic. I absolutely adore this image. And on top of that, in the foreground is actually the large right claw of the beast, and it looks just truly enormous. And what's fun too, in the foreground, in front of the claw even, you can see what look like cup islands. And there are multiple of them just floating, and they're relatively small compared to the image of the monster itself, to give you a really impressive sense of scale. Now, there's also some promo artwork that shows the same creature, except instead of it rising at a distance, it's instead coming directly at the camera. So it looks like it is attacking the person. It's coming to attack the viewer. It looks like the horrifying moment that the fisherman has when they're standing on the dock in a kaiju movie as it rises up out of the ocean and goes to swallow them right before they cut away to the researcher who's in the lab somewhere that's going to defeat the monster later. So it's very much that moment captured, and you can actually see a humanoid figure, looks like potentially a core, standing in the foreground looking up at this monster that's raging forward. I absolutely love it, and it definitely fits the flavor of the Raging Isle. So a 0/17 that has the ability to shift. Now, if you're playing in a mono blue deck, let's say you hit this on turn 4, right? So now you have a 0/17 on the board. Now you want to attack on turn 5. Let's assume all of your lands are islands and you hit all of your land drops. So on turn 5, you have 5 lands. You can pay 3, and all of a sudden this thing becomes a 5/12. So you'd have a 5/12 on turn 5, and then you could have a 6/11 on turn 6, and a 7/10 on turn 7, etc., etc. So if you have 3 mana up to constantly pay into it, you could have a really solid attacker. And beyond that, once you hit turn 6, you could even double activate it. In which case, you would pay 6 mana and turn it into a 12/5. So that could be potentially dangerous, because all of a sudden the toughness is reducing by quite a bit. But you can also do that at instant speed. So you can attack with a 0/17, and whether or not your opponent blocks it and what they block with can dictate what power you set it to. So if they don't block it with anything, you can just crank the dial on this thing. And, in integers of 3, as long as the number of islands you control are relatively within bounds. So that might actually be worth playing this in like a Simic ramp package, where you have access to just an obscene amount of mana, but only half your mana base is going to be islands. That way, the number of islands that you have might be 5, but you have access to 12 mana. And so you have a lot of flexibility with this guy as to how you can set the power and the toughness. And again, you can do that at instant speed. So if they don't block it with anything, you can just crank the dial on this thing and make it a 15/2 or, whatever it ends up being. and just deal an obscene amount of damage directly to their face. Now, that would open you up to things like shock, and so there's a little bit of a mind game, or if your opponent's running burn, you want to be a little bit more careful with that. But if they aren't, go crazy. Have some fun. So, all in all, I like Cherix. I think this card is really, really cool. There's also another interaction that I'd be remiss if I didn't point out. Now, this isn't going to be legal in Standard, which is very good, because holy cow, otherwise this would be truly absurd, and that is High Alert. High Alert is an enchantment that was in Ravnica Allegiance, and it says each creature you control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. There are a couple of other cards that do this, but I wanted to highlight High Alert specifically. And additionally, creatures you control can attack as though they didn't have Defender, which is irrelevant in this case, but it's very, very good. Like, it's just a good card. And so High Alert costs 3. So if you play High Alert on turn 3 followed by Charix on turn 4, you so you have a 0/17. However, it's a 0/17 that can hit like a 17/17 on turn 4 in blue-white. That's nutso. And that's going to be legal in Historic. And on top of that, you can combine it with a little card called Tetsuko Umazawa Fugitive. And yeah, huge shout out to the folks in my Discord who were discussing this earlier, because I got to be honest, I didn't see this on my own. It was a community moment when we had we discussed this. Tetsuko Umazawa Fugitive, creatures you control with power or toughness 1 or less can't be blocked. Now, Cherix technically has 0 power, so Tetsuko Umazawa makes Cherix completely and totally unblockable. Now, if you have High Alert, it hits with 17 damage, but its power is still technically 0. Therefore, you effectively have an unblockable 17/17 that can start swinging as early as turn 5. Because Tetsuko Umazawa only costs 2. So all of a sudden, your turn 2, Tetsuko Umazawa. Turn 3, High Alert. Turn 4, Cherix the Raging Isle. Turn 5, Prophet. That's like truly bonkers. Like, there's so much you can do with that. It's insane, and I absolutely love it. Cherix the Raging Isle is my kind of jank. This card is beautiful, it's powerful, it does what it does, and it does it very, very well. I am definitely going to be trying to brew something around this, and if you want to see that brew in action, I would highly recommend check me out on Twitch, twitch.tv/hamhocks42. That's where I try out all my silly brews. Most of them don't work out so great, but every so often I hit a winner, and yeah, definitely check that out. You can also check me out on YouTube. Oh, well, if you're listening to the podcast version, or you can check out this podcast as a podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. How many more times can I say podcast? Podcast. Okay, this is a short one and sweet one, but the truth is, I love this card. It's a gigantic crab monster. It's available in a couple of different artworks, both of which are truly gorgeous, and it just really, it makes me happy. Makes me super duper happy. Oh, and there's some flavor text. Zendikar's seas are deeper than anyone can fathom. Okay, there's a little bit of wordplay in there that I really appreciate. Fathom as a measure of depth and an understanding of cognition, I think, is really, really fantastic. So the idea that it's so deep no one can measure it, ha ha ha, I appreciate that. That's like a borderline pun that I appreciate. I think it's well done. And the fact that Zendikar Seas can maintain a creature like this is terrifying, because that's one of the things that we don't think about with huge monsters so much, the ecology behind a creature like this existing. Because there have to be things that are big enough to sustain this. This thing eats something. I'm just going to throw that out there. This thing has to be eating something, like multiple times a day, presumably, in order to stay this size. How big are those things? And how often are those just swimming about? Because that sounds pretty terrifying in and of itself. And that's just the chum that this thing survives off of. Anyway, crazy idea, and I absolutely love that. So Zendikar is a terrifying place, truly. And, you know, I know Ikoria was the lair of behemoths. At least that was the idea. And the truth is, Cherix the Raging Isle here, I think, is taking the cake as a behemoth that we can all appreciate. So yeah, thanks so much for hanging out. I appreciate you, and I will catch you next time. Don't forget that you are a good person, and you deserve to be happy.